If you struggle with muddy mixes, first of all, you're not alone. We've all been there. And there's a reason why your mix is muddy. In this video, I want to help you identify what that reason is. It might not be what you think, and how to fix it. Right out of the gate, your mix might feel muddy because your mixes in general feel pretty random. One mix might sound pretty good, the next mix sounds like hot garbage, and you don't know what the difference is. If your mixing process is pretty random, your mixes will likely be pretty random as well. You need a process that you go through so you can figure out where things are falling apart. I've got a process I've developed over the years that works great for me. You can have it for free. It's only 5 simple steps. Go check it out at 5stepmix.com. And it's free, by the way. First things first, what is a muddy mix anyway? I would define a muddy mix as a type of a bad mix. And I would define a bad mix as simply an unbalanced mix. What does that mean? If you imagine that your mix is divided into 5 frequency buckets: lows, low mids, mids, high mids, and highs. A muddy mix would be one where there's just too much low mids. It's not balanced with everything else. The low mids are being selfish. They're wanting all the attention and they're ruining everything. Here's an example of what a muddy mix sounds like. Here it's just muffled. That's an extreme example, but it almost sounds like you took a blanket and laid it over the speakers, so everything sounds like this, kind of. Here's what that would sound like without all that muddiness. Here's the tricky thing. We don't want to get rid of low mids entirely. They're very important. It's just that they tend to build up and become obnoxious if we don't smack them down and tell them to get back in line. Everything we record probably has a good chunk of frequencies in the low mid range to begin with. That's where a lot of the fundamental frequencies are. So our job as mix engineers is to make sure that those fundamental frequencies don't team up and sabotage the entire mix. Here's a way of thinking about mixing that might be different for you. I think of a muddy mix as simply an unfinished mix. Imagine you and I are making a sculpture. We get this big hunk of marble and we're making the statue of David, and we chip away and it's looking pretty good, except David's butt's too big. What do? He's got too much low mid information. So we're going to chisel away that butt until it's proportionate, balanced with the rest of the sculpture. That's a lot of what mixing is, just minus the chisels. Fat bottom mix, you make the rocking world go round. Quick timeout for question of the day. Leave a comment below. What's your biggest struggle in mixing? Do you tend towards muddy mixes or do you tend towards bright and harsh mixes? Fun fact, the cure is almost identical for both, so stick around. We've established the main symptom of muddy mixes is excessive low mid-range. That's great, but what's the actual cause? How do we treat this disease of fat-bottomed mixes? Fat bottom mix. And the answer is more than just EQ, because we really have to get to the cause. What's causing this mud, and let's fix it there. So there are 2 main categories you might think of in terms of what's making your mix muddy. The first is the mix itself, how you're approaching the mix. The second is the recording itself. Let's start there. I've been saying it for 15 years. Get it right at the source. You're tired of hearing it. I'm not tired of saying it because it's true. If my recordings are muddy, my mixes will be muddy. There's not much that I can do about it. Why not make it not muddy at the source? Here's an example. If I record an acoustic guitar that sounds like this, have a muddy mix. Yeah, I can try to fix it with EQ, but it's always going to be a less than approach than simply recording a better sounding acoustic that's not as muddy. What's the main culprit here? A thing called proximity effect. The closer the source is to a directional microphone, it does get louder, obviously, but also the bass response goes way up. It's like an EQ. It's the physics of the way it works. The closer I get to this mic, the more low frequencies the mic will pick up in my voice. That's why your favorite radio DJs get right up on the microphone so that they hear the deep, low end. Great for radio, terrible for recording things like acoustic guitar. I gotta back this mic quite a ways away from the guitar to make it sound more balanced and less muddy. It's no surprise, I'm not a big fan of the phrase, let's just fix it in the mix. It's used too often to excuse crappy recordings. However, there are things that we can fix to a degree in the mix, right? I've never had an acoustic guitar recording that was absolutely perfect that didn't need a little bit of help with EQ in the mix. Typically, even if I do my job making it not super boomy and muddy in the recording, I might still need to remove some of the low mids and even the low end to make it sit nicely with everything else in the mix. That's part of our job as the mix engineer. The raw recordings might be amazing, but once we start stacking them on top of each other, those low mids stack up even higher because every instrument has a good chunk of low mids to it. And our job is to make sure that those don't get out of hand. And we do that by primarily using tools like EQ to decide who gets the attention in the low end versus who doesn't. The second piece of the mixing puzzle is huge. And so many people are gonna just nod their heads and agree and then move on and ignore this advice. So hey, listen up, pay attention. You gotta know your frequencies. Now you're nodding your head and you're saying, yeah, Joe, I gotta know my frequencies. You really gotta know your frequencies. If I say 50 hertz, 100 hertz, 200 hertz, and you don't instantly have a recognition of what each of those frequencies sounds like in a mix, you've got work to do. Because 50 and 100 and 200 are vastly different from one another. Even though they're just a little section of the EQ curve, they are responsible for so much of your heartache in your mixes. If you can't differentiate between these frequencies, you're going to have a really hard time figuring out where the mud is on your mix, which tracks are causing it, and then which frequencies to EQ out. If you don't know what you're looking for, how are you ever going to find it? Spend some time becoming familiar with what each of those frequency ranges sounds like, and you'll find you'll start to feel like you have like some sort of a magic gift where you can just spot muddiness, go find it, and pull that sucker out before it ever becomes a problem. Now, here's another aspect to this whole muddy mixes thing that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, but it needs to be said, even though it's probably going to hurt some feelings. The problem might be you, but it's not your fault. Here's what I'm talking about. As a musical society, there's this word that gets thrown around all the time, and it's always positive. We kind of love to use this word. That word is warm. We like to describe a microphone as having a nice warm tone. I love the warmth of that mix. I love the warmth of that guitar amp. Warm, 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 warm. Well, guess what? You can be too warm, right? You ever had too many blankets on? It's too warm under here. Warmth is a good thing. Too much warmth makes me hot and sweaty and AKA muddy. The same thing happens to your mixes. When I was learning about electric guitars early on, I played acoustic guitar my whole life. When I started to pick up electric guitars, I had realized there's kind of two big categories of pickups. There are single coil pickups like Stratocaster, Telecaster, and there are humbucker pickups like Les Paul. And they're very different sounding. And when I first heard someone describe the difference, they described the humbucker as a hotter output, so it's louder and it's thicker and it's warmer. And I was sold. I didn't even have to hear the two. I just knew, erroneously, that humbuckers were for me. And I spent the next many years of my life only playing humbuckers because I just said, well, they used the word warm to describe them, and I like warm, so I must be a humbucker player. Sadly, I missed out on all the beauty of Telecasters and Stratocasters because I was so fixated on humbuckers. Nothing wrong with humbuckers. I still love them to this day, but that demonstrates that the influence that words like warm can have on our psyches. And just because something is warm doesn't mean it might not be real close to being muddy, or it might not be making our mix muddy. So here's my exercise I want to give you. There can be of course your mix needs to be warm. Of course there need to be elements in your mix that just feel like a warm hug. The problem is when your mix is muddy, you've got too much of that warmth happening. So what I want you to do is go find a song. Right now, you're probably thinking of a song that you remember as being really nice and warm. Something professionally released that you think of, man, I love the warmth of that mix. Go back and listen to it with this in mind. Listen to which elements in the mix are actually warm and thick and which elements aren't. What you will find, and I've got an example in my head I'll talk about in a second, what you will find is that there's only a handful of things that are responsible for all the warmth in the mix, and the rest of the stuff is pretty thin sounding. The example that comes to my mind is the song Everything in Its Right Place by Radiohead. Go listen to it. I'm not going to play it here because of copyright, but it's on the album Kid A. It's the opening track, and it starts with this Fender Rhodes sound that is just so thick and beautiful and warm, and it goes throughout the entire song. It's the hero of the song, the hero of the mix. And as you listen, I just did this before turning on the camera to shoot this video. As you listen to that, you'll notice the primary warm thing in that mix is that Fender Rhodes. The vocal, pretty thin. The background vocals and all the extra sounds that happen, pretty thin. The electric guitars, very thin. Drums, there's a low kick drum that's got some warmth to it that kind of does the boom, boom, boom. And then there's bass, of course, which kind of handles the low frequencies. But as far as low mids are concerned, there's really one hero, and it's that Fender Rhodes. Everything else had to be subservient to that Fender Rhodes sound. So what does that mean for you and your mixes? When you're starting to mix, you can only have, it's almost like you have a budget. I can only give out so many low mid dollars to people in this mix. The rest of you don't get any. I'm sorry, there's only so much that I can give. That helps you decide who gets to be the hero. When it comes to low frequencies, that's really easy. Kick drum, bass guitar. That's about it, right? The occasional like cello or orchestra or something like that has some deep low end, but that's pretty easy. Low mids, you got to make some decisions. You got to decide, are the guitars going to be the hero or the keyboards or maybe a combination of both, but I can only have so much and I've got to distribute that in a way that makes the mix sound good. Do yourself a favor. Go listen to one of your favorite warm mixes. Go listen to Everything in Its Right Place. Everything in Its Right Place by Radiohead, and pay attention to both what's warm and what's not. You'll learn more by paying attention to what's not warm, and then you can apply that thinking process, that mindset to your next mix. The final thing that might be contributing to muddy mixes is the types of tracks that you're recording. Setting the muddy recording aside, you might just be recording a lot of thick sounding stuff that once you blend it all together, you've really got nowhere to go but muddy when it comes time to mix. Here's what I mean. Let's say we're doing just a basic acoustic song, a bunch of acoustic guitars and a vocal track. Already, we're at risk of being muddy because an acoustic guitar only has so many sounds to it. But you can make it worse by doing stuff like this. Let's say we record this as our main, like chord progression. And then let's say we double that. So we've got one left and one right, both playing that. That's fine, but it's already pretty warm, right? Pretty thick. If we then come in and say, well, let's record two more doubles, and we go, it's not different enough. It's just going to cause more mid-range in there. It's going to make it a nightmare come mix time. And if we might say, well, we're going to play it more open, so more like, better, because you get some of those open strings, but still, it's all kind of centering around this little chunk of frequencies right here. That's going to make it muddy. What would be better is to think of parts that will break away from this kind of thick core that you laid down. I laid down this. I need to let that be. Let that be full and thick and beautiful and wonderful. Now let's come up with parts that can work around that. So it can be as simple as like something like that. That gives me a nice chimey thing, or I could even strum it, right? Something like that over those thick chords works out really well. Or I could play a voicing up here that's like, something like, something like that over those chords. It's a different voicing. You get the idea. If I'm keeping everything down here, it's going to be muddy once I get past maybe 2 or 3 tracks. If I want to produce it out and make it beautiful and have a bunch of cool things going on, that's great. But we got to think outside of that one little box of mud that we established with our first couple of tracks. It's not mud yet, but if we add more to it, it will be. Let's go with some brighter things. Let's do less of the warm things. Your mixes will start to sound better just by making this change. Here's a little game you can play next time you go to record something. Record as many tracks as you need for the song, but don't put any mixing plugins on there. And the goal is to see how great can I make this sound without any mixing. If I just listen to the raw tracks and I pan them and I move the faders, but I don't do anything else to them, how great can I make it sound? If you play that game every time you're in the studio working on a song, it'll change everything. You'll go from fighting your mixes to saying, man, this already sounds great. I can do a little things in the mix to enhance it. Sure, but I'm no longer like fighting against bad, muddy recordings. I'm enhancing something that was already great. That is the shift that when that happens for you, game over. Hey, thanks so much for watching until the end. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help. And if you want another video from me, one of my most popular videos about how to use EQ, specifically 3 rules that you need to follow, check out this video. Thanks. See ya.